Session 4 of the conference. Let's start. Architecture, current responses to the Baltics in flux, will be about how the great world of change brings various changes in the work of an architect, how new architectural practices and activities are thought and operated. We invited innovative, unusual, experimental practices to see the tasks and formats we might need to work with in the future. Such questions as, what are the tools and resources we can use to create new environments for living? And how do we perform in the context of new technological advancements, such as some of the fastest internet connections in the world? What are the new briefs for architects of tomorrow? And we're starting our session with a talk by Mike Emmerik. It's called A City of Comings and Goings. Mike Emmerik is an urbanist and a partner at Crimson Historians and Urbanists, and school coordinator at the Independent School of the City. He is educated as an urban designer at the Delft University of Technology and subsequently worked in the Faculty of Architecture for 5 years as a teacher and researcher within the chair of design as politics. Mike collaborated in various research and design projects at the intersection of urban development and policy making, and is affiliated with the Dutch Board of Government Advisors, from which he advises the central government and local authorities about issues related to urbanization and mobility. He has been involved with various international teaching and design projects in Lebanon, Germany, Ghana, Cuba, and others. Welcome.
That I'm here. Now it works. Well, thanks to everyone, I would say. I'm going to be, so my name is Mike Emmerik. I'm an urbanist. I'm part of Crimson Historians and Urbanists, as was explained already. And I'll be talking about a project that we initiated a couple of years ago, which is called A City of Comings and Goings, which deals with the spatial impact of migration. Part of this research, and you might have seen some of the results already, was also shown at the Vienna's Architecture Biennale of 1.5 years ago, and has also resulted in the publication of a book, which has been launched just before the summer. And the starting point for us to kind of dive into this research was, of course, the 2015 refugee crisis. So at least in the Netherlands, like a lot of people from the Middle East and from Africa arrived to the cities, and what we saw in the Netherlands was actually quite that people were quite surprised by this huge influx of people, and all around the Netherlands, emergency shelters had to be erected. Gymnasiums were transformed into sleeping facilities. Tent camps were erected. Bungalow parks and vacation homes were rented out to house all the people that came to the country. And of course, this also created quite a bit of social tension. And this happened not only in the Netherlands, but you've seen this in quite a few cities all around Europe. And of course, on the one hand, there were people saying, like, okay, let's welcome everyone, let's open the borders, let's try to help as much as possible. On the other hand, we also saw that people were kind of threatened by this response, or by this influx of people, and responded with questions like, yeah, what about me? And when we started this research, and this was kind of an important image for us, is that kind of this social tension can be explained by only looking at these two maps. On the one hand, it shows the facilities where refugees and migrants were being housed at that moment, which was mainly in the eastern side of the Netherlands. While if you, for example, look at the job opportunities and the vacancies in terms of employment, they mainly exist in the West. So you can imagine that this created quite some tension as well. The same thing kind of counts for the housing market. The rules were in such a way, organized in such a way that refugees who were granted a residence permit in the Netherlands had or were supposed to have a priority on the social housing market. And of course what happened is, because there is not enough social housing in the whole country, what happened was that people that were on the waiting list for quite some time, of course got angry and said like, hey, I'm waiting for a couple of years already, and why do these people get priority? So for us, this was kind of a realization that apart from it being a social issue, it's also a spatial issue. And what we started to do was, in this research project, was to very much focus on like how can the city, how can our cities, and how can architecture and urban planning contribute actually to making the cities much more adaptable for the influx and outflux of people. And in this project, we mainly focused on Western European cities, because, of course, if you look from a more historical point of view, they are much better comparable and kind of deal with the same type of questions. Well, and just to show the relevance of this kind of thinking and what we're doing here in the conference, of course, as well, is that if we like it or not, migration is going to stay for the coming decades, probably. If you only look at the population growth in Africa, which now has around 1.1 billion people, but is projected to grow to 4 billion people, it's only a matter of time until at least some of the people will kind of move around the globe in its search for also a better future. Because if you look at the top two maps, you also see that the places where the population is growing fastest, it's also the places that are the most that has the most poverty. Of course, there's also reasons for war and conflicts that people kind of flee their countries, and climate change is an increasing factor, kind of driving migration from places that are becoming less and less inhabitable, also mainly in Africa. So what we kind of did in this research is to take a little bit of a more pragmatic approach, and also to kind of look like how can we as an office of architects, architectural historians and urbanists, how can we kind of contribute to the discussion about migration? And one of the things that we decided was, let's zoom out a bit. Let's kind of take a little bit more of a helicopter view on the issue of migration, and to on the one hand, look at it from a much more historical perspective. It has been said in the first session as well. I mean, if you look at history, migration has always been around, and it has been an important driver and an important force in shaping our cities. And for example, also from a much more pragmatic and spatial way, this image here in the top or in the bottom left is in France in the 1960s. And we can almost not imagine anymore this type of living conditions being part of our cities. But of course, when from 2015 onwards, when the jungle in Calais appeared, it kind of has a similar spatial structure and a kind of similar housing conditions. And we were able to deal with that in the past. Can we not deal with? We know how to deal with it also now, but we don't do it. The other thing that we decided to do was to zoom out in terms of the type of migrants, because if you're only talking about refugees and asylum seekers, the discussion directly becomes quite polarized. And so for this project, we said, like, can we not kind of look at global migration in all sorts of, in all its forms, from exchange students to working migrants to tourists to the digital nomads, and to kind of look at this phenomenon from a broader perspective, and kind of try to find out where are the similarities. Of course, all this group have different needs and reasons why to migrate, but there's also quite a lot of similarities that could help us to think in a different perspective about our cities. And when you start zooming into these different groups and start looking at, like, especially like how they are being treated and what type of regulations apply to these different groups of migrants, it of course directly becomes clear that we are quite biased in how we deal with different groups of migrants. Some we kind of welcome, and we even try to we even set up promotion campaigns to lure international students to well, whatever university in the world. There's welcome parties being organized for a smooth integration in the student life, or if you're an expat, there's special events organized for you so that you can meet like-minded people. But of course, there's also the other side of the story in migration, of people that we're really trying to keep out, and if possible, as far as possible from our borders. And this duality in how we deal with different types of migrants is also changing. Because if, like, yesterday we've been talking also about tourism and how that kind of benefits from an economical point of view the cities. And of course that's true. But there's also there's also an increasing tendency in Western European cities that says, like, maybe there should be a stop to the mass tourism in certain cities, because it drives up housing prices, etc. So on the left, it's an image from Barcelona saying, "Tourist, your luxury trip, my daily misery." And the one on the right is like a guerrilla campaign from Berlin trying to protest against the impact of Airbnbs in the city. And it's actually something that you can kind of see all around. The whole idea of global capital trying to find a place of investment, people, expats coming from a certain economical background who are much more wealthy or equipped to kind of pay huge amounts of money to buy a property in the cities, is really driving up prices and raises questions about affordability. Another interesting notion that was part of this, like that we found out during this research, or that we kind of realized during this research, is how this duality and how we deal with migration and the different types of migrants, that also kind of reflects back to the fiscal manifestation of our cities. So, of course, in a way, you can say that the city centers of our Western European cities are increasingly starting to look alike. Not only from an architectural point of view, because the architecture, of course, was there for quite some time, but if you think about the types of coffee bars that you can find in every city, exactly the same ones, or the retail chains that kind of occupy or dominate our streetscapes. And what you kind of see is that these, especially the inner cities, are kind of completely catering for the global citizens, for people, for tourists, for the expats, for the exchange students, to kind of seamlessly continue your life as you were used to in the place where you grew up. But what is interesting to see as well is that if you move outside the inner city and you kind of cross a railroad or a highway or a river, you find yourself in places that look completely different but still similar to each other. In the same cities, a different picture of the suburbs. which has kind of a similar architecture kind of, or spatial kind of vibe to it, but in which also different type of lifestyle is being facilitated. And something that really targets different types of migrants as well in the city. And what is interesting is when you kind of look at the maps, that also is more or less being confirmed. These maps all show the places or these 4 cities and where the biggest group of migrants are being located or where they move in. And you really see that cities are kind of trying to develop 2 different worlds. And one of the conclusions that you can draw from this is that, well, on the one hand, you could say that our cities are much better connected to each other. Huh? You can move from Rome to Amsterdam and kind of continue the same life, but at the same, or from the suburbs of France to the suburbs of London. But you also see that the cities themselves are much more falling apart. So if you look at it's almost 2 parallel networks or multiple parallel networks that are being created through migration. So what we did as part of this research is kind of look at 6 different cities and see how migration has kind of influenced the development of these cities, but also what can we learn more or less from this, from a more historical point of view. So what we did was we asked 6 researchers from that were living and working in these cities. So Aarhus in Denmark, Berlin, Germany, Vienna in Austria, Prato in Italy, Tuscany, and London, and Amsterdam. Really trying to kind of dig into the role that migration has played in those cities. And I'm just going to briefly go through the different cases. So the first one is Vienna, where Elke Krasny wrote a kind of chapter in the book about how that city is kind of, how the urban development of that city is kind of linked to migration. And she uses the case of 2 streets, actually, the Ringstraße and the Lerchenfelderstraße. And she kind of tries to make a comparison by looking at the dynamics in those streets. And the Ringstraße is an interesting example. How she writes about it is that it was part of the city extension of Vienna in the beginning of the 1900s, and it was mainly made possible by the financial means of Jewish migrants coming to the city. And it was built mainly by a Czech workforce. So apart from the fact that the cities were growing due to people coming to the city, also the realization of the Ringstraße, which is kind of a proud part of Vienna, has also been closely related to foreign capital and workforce coming into the city. And she compares that to the Lerchenfelderstraße, which is actually from the beginning of this century, or at least was revamped in the beginning of this century, but actually has become a vibrant city thanks to the more recent migrants. So mainly people from Southeast Asia, mainly people from the Middle East, have kind of taken over that street and have kind of brought new life to it. So most of the shop life and the urban dynamics in these streets are thanks actually to the newcomers. Justine Yen-Tribion, who was here yesterday with us as well in the first session, he kind of wrote he wrote a piece about London where he was living there at that moment. And he kind of took the case of the High Street quite central in his talk. And also, it's a little bit similar as the case in Vienna, where the high streets kind of have are struggling to survive, or at least they used to be at least the places where all Londoners actually gathered and did their shopping, and where a lot of the neighborhood life happened. On a certain moment, those streets were, well, dying, let's say, and thanks to the newcomers, thanks to migrants, the streets have become completely vibrant again. And he explicitly writes about the High Street in Peckham, which is a very multicultural neighborhood. And it also shows like how migration and kind of the way our cities are functioning are very strongly related to each other. Another case was Germany, where Stefan Lanz wrote about Kreuzberg. Kreuzberg being, in the time of the division of Berlin, being related in close proximity to the wall, and therefore not that popular to live in. But at the same time, this created, or because of this, there was a huge amount of housing stock in Kreuzberg, which kind of, when the Turkish migrants moved in, they found their houses here. And this kind of mixed with groups of artists and activists that also were attracted by this, like, availability of big, of a lot of empty housing. And this created, well, very interesting urban dynamics where the cultural, where the culture of the Turkish migrants kind of merged with the artists. And created, well, the Berlin as we know it, or at least it can be used to explain the Berlin as we know it. And what is also kind of interesting, and we see that also all around our cities, is that exactly these dynamics have made this area so popular that prices are going up, and actually the gentrification is on the rise. And now one of the places that was always very contested, the Cottbuser Tor, has now become quite a popular tourist attraction, where there's now a hostel inside, and it attracts, again, different types of migrants, which are tourists. Another case is the one of Aarhus in Denmark, where Signe Sofie Bogild wrote about. And interesting about Aarhus is that it used to be quite a small town in the beginning of the 1900s. But in the 20s, there were a lot of investments being done to get a university there. And this university, like throughout time, started to attract a lot of international students, really started to put Aarhus on the map again, or on the map, and has now very much became quite a global city with a lot of urban dynamics, which was European capital of culture in 2017. And really gave, really helped Aarhus to develop into the city that it is now at the moment, thanks also to the international students. Two more cases I'm gonna talk about. There is Massimo Bresson wrote an interesting piece about Prato in Tuscany, Italy, and what is interesting about this case is that Prato has a big expansion, industrial expansion to the city, which was mainly used for the textile industry. But on a certain moment, the textile industry declined, and the warehouses were empty. But what was interesting is that exactly that moment kind of collided with the more open door policy of China. The Deng Xiaoping said that people could leave the country and find work somewhere else, or try to live somewhere else. And in Prato, a lot of Chinese people moved in. And again, this created a very interesting mixture between the two cultures. So there's a quite spectacular Italian-Chinese cuisine that has been developed in Prato. But it also has given new life to the city that kind of was facing issues with the industry that left. And what is interesting now is that the government has really embraced the fact that there's so many Chinese people in the city. And they develop all sorts of cultural and social initiatives, but also use urban planning as a way to kind of stimulate the migration or the integration between the two parts, between the two cultures. The last case that I'll talk about, and it's the case that I can personally relate to much more, is the one of the Bijlmer, which was written about by my colleague Anushka Pronkhorst and a former student of mine, Lena Knappers. And what is interesting in the case of the Bijlmer, and of course Amsterdam has, if you look at the history of Amsterdam, it really grew thanks to migration being an important trading hub in the 17th century. But the interesting case of the Bijlmer is that it was like the modernist dream, and one of the most pure ones maybe in Western Europe that was being developed. Huge honeycomb flats were built for the middle class, but it has only been successful for more or less 2 years. So the first people that moved in very much liked it, to live in this modern dream. But when the suburbs started to develop a bit further out of Amsterdam, people started moving there, and the Bijlmer was for a large part empty. And that moment that the Bijlmer that the middle class moved out, some of the Dutch colonies, former colonies, became independent. And what was interesting is that, especially the case of Suriname in South America, a lot of people before that independence came to the Netherlands to claim their citizenship. And because the Bijlmer was empty, there was this huge amount of housing stock. There was a huge community created of Suriname people living in this modernist building blocks. And well, throughout the years, of course, or maybe not of course, but that became a little bit more problematic, and now the majority of these flats have been demolished and have been, their new houses have been built there for different types of people as well. So these cases kind of illustrate how migration and the way our cities have been formed, how that's so much intertwined and interconnected with each other. Next to these essays that are part of the book, we also looked at, we questioned ourselves actually, like, how are we doing as an architecture profession or as an urban profession? Like, what type of projects can be illustrative for that cater for migration? So in this, in the countries of these 6 case studies, we made a catalog of 100 projects, in which we tried to kind of score how they were dealing with migration, or how they were helping or facilitating migration. And we looked at 3 important elements in this. Robustness, so let's say how long-lasting a certain initiative is. We looked at whether it facilitates shared space in the way that people can meet each other or can use a space to kind of develop their own, organize themselves. But also we looked at what type of initiatives are really helping emancipation. So the idea that you can climb a social ladder when you arrive into a country. And, well, I'm not going to go through all hundreds, but just to give you an overview of the type of projects that are in there, it really ranges from services, so markets, public libraries that also are giving information for newcomers how to get around in the city. There's housing projects, of course, that kind of try to incorporate as many different backgrounds as possible. There's apps, so it's not only the built environment. It's also there's also a lot of services that kind of help finding your way around. So this one is Move to Denmark app. If you ever plan to do so, check out the app. And there's furniture hiring services, and of course there's also more social initiatives that, for example, in the Netherlands or this one is in London, but for the Netherlands quite important as well, a bike project which really emancipates people to kind of move around without any cost. Based on this, we managed to subtract 6 theses that we say, like, okay, these are the things that you should take into account when developing or when thinking for cities that that contribute to the absorption capacity of cities, so that they can facilitate migration and that certain social tensions can be reduced. And one of the most important conclusions is basically a housing issue. So the affordability of housing in the cities is of course for everyone an issue, but especially when big groups of people move in, or it's important to kind of think ahead and plan and create huge amounts of affordable housing in our cities, so that this absorption capacity is becoming bigger. The second one that we kind of drew out of this was the adaptability. So, well, the fact that we're here in an old warehouse kind of also shows that the power of adaptable architecture, but the same kind of counts for housing, and for urban spaces, that they should be as adaptable as possible. Third statement is that we really need to create robust architecture. What you see is that what you see a lot is that the thinking goes that people that temporarily stay in a certain city also need temporary housing. But of course, if you look at migration as a more constant factor and not to the time that people kind of spend in a certain place, but the fact that people are coming every time, it's very, very important to invest in sturdy and robust architecture. The other one is shared space. So the importance of shared space, not only public space where everybody can use, but also places where people can organize themselves. So it's from the church to the parks and everything in between should be present in the city to kind of facilitate the influx of people. Another important part is to include migrants in the community and the economy. One of the first slides that I showed, where there's this disbalance between where people are being housed and where the work is located, should really be avoided. I think if we plan better where to house people that are coming to our cities, and kind of use this also to bring new energy in certain parts of the city, and to kind of complement missing workforces. That's a very important part. And the last one is that we should create new icons for public values and for public services that can really broadcast and kind of show also the pride that we have in how our cities are being formed by migration. And of course, these 6 theses are nothing new, in the sense that they also create interesting cities for all of us. It's not that it's only migration, only targeting migration. It's just making our cities better. But we do hope that when taking this much more into account when planning and when thinking about the future of our cities, yeah, we can create a better cities of comings and goings. So thank you.